give a fuck? Why do I give a fuck? Why do I try so hard? Why do I care so much?
Welcome to Why Do I Give a Fuck? A cross-cultural conversation between myself, Diane Tate,
and Johanna Thompson. In these times of great struggle and possible shift, we ask ourselves,
why do we give a fuck about any of it? How does the lens we see the world through impact what we see?
And what do we do about it? Here we are having another conversation about what is it that we do about it? And so much has been going on personally in our lives and politically in our communities. And so, yeah, it's an opportunity for us to get back on the conversation that we have. Primaries have happened across the nation. And there's been some whoa moments. There's been some hooray moments. There's been some shocker moments. But it's what we have become used to as we go through this entire political scheme that's been going on since this new administration has been in administration.
Yeah. I love listening to our intro because at the end of it, your voice always just resonates with me when you say, and what are we going to do about it?
Because what are we going to do
about it? What are we going to do about it?
Conversation. It's it's becoming so much more laborious, to think about what are the ways that we can have an impact. I know primaries happened and I'm in California, so I was remiss about being able to meet the deadline to have a vote by mail because I thought that I would be back in Florida. And I'm curious as to how many people were disenfranchised in some way. Mine was a self-created obstacle to being able to vote.
Mine too.
Just because I wasn't, I was prepared to be back in Florida. I typically, even wherever I'm at, typically fly in, but because of the extraneous circumstances that I'm in, I wasn't able to get back to Florida, and I missed the July 6th deadline to be able to vote in our August 18th primaries. And I wanted to because there were some really strong races that I wanted to make sure that I participated in. And I heard that you kind of had the same thing going on with you.
Oh my God. Your story is so much better than mine. Because I have voted now here in Connecticut for, I think this is my 6th year. And I was a registered Democrat all of those times. And last year, I changed my affiliation to independent. And I had kind of forgotten that I had done that. And because I had voted in previous years, it didn't occur to me, or I knew and I forgot that Connecticut is a closed primary state. And so I get on my primary day and I'm all excited. I'm going to go vote. And I've got my Black Voters Matter shirt on. I always have to pick the right shirt,
Yeah.
Gotta send the right message. You got to have the right pins on, and I'm all dressed and ready to go. And a lot of times when I walk into election, and maybe this is after so many years of being in South Carolina, when I walk into an election, a polling place, it almost feels like I almost feel like I'm going in there trying to see who is going to give me side eye or say something nasty.
Okay.
Because South Carolina, the polling places could be very much like that, especially for someone that might be wearing a shirt or something that expresses a progressive mindset. And so I always feel like I'm a little bowed up, and I'm walking in there like, come on, mess with me. I dare you. So I get all the way in there and I hand them my ID. And she looks for my name and she looks for my address, and I'm not on the list. And
you're not voting today, baby.
No, she's like, "Are you a Democrat?" And I said, "Oh my God, I had totally forgotten that I had changed my affiliation to independent." And so I pivoted, turned my little sweet butt around, and walked right out. And the people that were outside that had given me this whole spiel about somebody that was running for a probate officer, I came back out and she was like, "Well, that was quick." I said, "Yeah, I don't get to vote, and I'm not a registered Democrat." So that was a little bit of a moment of egg on my face. For sure.
Well, egg on your face, but then also just a reminder about the different states and people being reminded that there are closed primaries and then there's open primaries, and then also helping folks to understand the distinction by that. When we talk about a closed primary, Florida is one of the states that also has a closed primary, meaning that they only allow you to vote in the election if you have registered yourself as either a Republican or a Democrat. And that's just for the primaries. It's not for the general election that's coming up in November. But this is like for the primaries, it is an expectation that people make a decision about choosing either party, either the Republican or the Democratic Party, because there's independent parties, as Diane was registered as, there's non-party affiliates, there's libertarians, there's Green Party. So you can have all of those associations as an American voter, as a US voter. However, when there's a closed primary in the state, they only allow people who are registered Democrats or registered Republicans to actually vote in those primary elections. So I wanted to make those distinctions. And both of us were unable. I'm also considered a super voter in Florida. So I was on the computer looking at what the races are, looking at what the results are, really paying attention to some of the things that were going on, and then seeing all the things that were going on in the other states. And I was just like, after receiving all of the text messages on my phone every day that I had to stop to end from both parties, Republican and Democrats, after hearing people make their pleas for some of the major issues that were coming up, a lot of folks were talking about healthcare. A lot of folks were talking about disenfranchisement to the polls, and specifically in Florida, that's a lot that was happening. A lot of folks are talking about the cost of living and gas prices, making stuff affordable. What else were some of the major themes that we were hearing?
Did you say healthcare? Because I heard,
healthcare was one of the first things. Yeah, that was a major thing. Oh, housing costs and affordability to be able to, live in the home or in the communities that you want to live in, especially for folks that are working long jobs. And then, of course, our migration immigrant population considerations. So a lot of those things were happening in conversation in Florida. But then I also was hearing Michigan had some interesting wins going on. I heard, what's going on in South Carolina. We're trying to identify, who should be in representation versus who is appointed versus who has had a long history of working in politics and legislation and policy. And so it's been a very exhausting primary season, a very exhausting election season to me. And one of the things that I was dealing with in that is, how do we get through, like, not be adverse to the conflict or adverse to all of the energy that goes into thinking about what our local politics are going to look like and what the impact of that is going to look like for us as a nation going forward, because we have some major issues going on. We have wars, we have genocides, we have people not being able to meet their needs in a major way. And so that is a huge concern. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, since we're having this conversation, is what was the reason for the decision to switch from the Democratic Party to independent, and then kind of like forgetting about that designation and causing an inability to be able to vote in the primaries?
I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it was probably a bit of a temper tantrum, I would say. I mean, I am no longer, I used to be one of those vote blue no matter who people, and I have definitely been on a journey of unpacking that undying and unfettered affiliation and support for the Dems, because I've been just opening my eyes to the decisions that they make over and over and over again, that I think I've said on this podcast before that I really see them, Dems and Republicans, as two sides of the same coin. We have a two-party system for a reason, and both parties uphold the maintenance of that two-party system because it serves them. It's really just about the power class. It's not about, I used to think that there was such a big difference between a Democrat and Republican. I used to think that Democrats were all about people and diversity and equity and human rights and access to healthcare and all of the things, and that Republicans weren't. And I really don't see that as this in the same way as I used to. So it really was probably more of a had I realized that Connecticut was a closed primary, would I have done it? Probably not, because I feel like it's important, as pissy as it makes me to think that, we have states in this country that have closed primaries that don't enable people that don't necessarily subscribe to one party or the other makes it impossible for them to vote during the primaries, as you were just saying. And so that pisses me off. And I want to rail against that. But if you want to participate, you gotta play the game on some level. So yeah, probably switching. If I had an easy answer to that, I switched because I was pissed. I didn't want to be an affiliated Democrat anymore. And it would have been really nice when I was online and changing my affiliation that there would have been a little pop-up window that said, hey, you live in Connecticut, and if you're not one of these party affiliates, you aren't going to be able to vote in the primaries. If you're okay with that, click this box. That would have been
folks
nice.
wanted to make it easy to accept and count all votes. Then those type of things would be available.
Yeah. So it's just another example of how this country wants to make it as difficult as possible. And I know to a lot of people listening, I'm probably speaking to the choir, but wants to make it as difficult as possible for people to vote. It is not a country that, and it doesn't matter which party you belong to, I believe, this is my opinion, that they don't want you to vote because it's so much more easier to get what they want or to maintain the power that they want to maintain when people are not allowed to vote. So that's why this conversation.
That's why this conversation always comes up about voter disenfranchisement and how do we engage people more civically. And there's such a narrative that happens in the United States where people are like not wanting to go and vote because they don't think that their vote is going to count anyway.
Right.
And as we're having this discussion, what is exciting to see in this moment is that the political economy is shifting, and what is defined as a Democrat is actually shifting. And we've seen that historically. You and I were talking about this before we actually put record on to start the conversation, like how historically we can look at how party ideology has shifted. And right now, I asked you that question about why you switched out of being a Democrat. I have always been registered as a Democrat and I've kept it there. I want to also make the distinction to those out there listening is that you could be registered with one party affiliation and then vote however it is that you choose to vote. So if you're listening to different countries and everything like that, you can be a part of a specific party and vote when it comes to the election.
In the general, general election.
In the way that you choose, depending on how your ballot comes to you. So I just wanted to make that clear. But in this moment, when what we understand as Republican and what we understand as Democrat, that the ideology of those parties, because people are so outside of having their needs being met, is shifting. And so we have this conversation about democratic socialists now, we have about democratic centrists now, we have really conservative Democrats. And then because I get information more from the Democratic Party, I'm not so sure, and I don't like to speak on things that I don't know about. But the Republicans, also have like kind of a conservatism that's happening there, some that are more MAGA aligned and related under the Republican Party. And so you are seeing like a spectrum even throughout the parties of how people's ideologies are shifting and changing, and the way that those narratives are being blown up. Specific to, if we turn to some of the primary races that we can talk about, I know that in Michigan, there was a saying, I do not remember the name of the person who was elected in a landslide, very much like what we saw in Florida with Angie Nixon. But this person, the tagline that was associated with him was that the many outvoted the money. And that is a big central conversation that's been happening where the many and people are standing up against the establishment and the administration that exists right now in representation to say, the policies that are being pushed forward are policies that we don't agree with, regardless of what party affiliation there is. I mean, in Florida and in the closed states, the only ways that you're able to see that represented, is both people that are registered as either Democrats or Republicans. Right. But the larger sentiment of folks that even people who didn't get to vote in closed primaries, most U.S. citizens at this stage of the game are saying that we are not in alignment with the way that our administration, that our local government is being run, and our needs are not being met for affordability, for healthcare, for our educational systems, and just for our ability to sustain and to thrive in the United States in this moment. And so we're seeing that reflected through the elections.
Yeah, I think you're talking about, and we spoke about him on a previous episode, Dr. Abdul El Sayed.
Thank you. Yes, yes.
Yeah, who won the Michigan primary for U.S. Senate, and so that was an amazing, and it was a landslide, and he was greatly outspent, especially by AIPAC, which is the political lobby for Israel.
Hmm.
They spent for his opposition, they spent like 30 million, and he still won, which we talked about this in the
The
previous
same
episode
thing.
that
Yeah.
that's a big deal, in this country because usually money equals wins. And then another race that we were kind of that you alluded to that we were talking about in Florida was also a US Senate race, primary race. Angie
Yes.
Nixon won
Yes.
her primary to
Okay.
run for US Senate in Florida, and she is a DSA member. Dr. El Sayed, I don't believe is a DSA member, but she is. And I was just drawing that comparison, but she won against Alexander Vindman, who folks might remember he and his twin brother kind of came into notoriety and awareness back in Trump's first impeachment. I believe it was his brother that testified against Trump in the first impeachment trial. And so that's where the Vindmans kind of came into at least my awareness and I think many others across the country. And he greatly outspent her. I mean, he has millions and millions and millions of dollars in his coffers. Let me say he didn't outspend her. I think what I'm hearing is that he didn't spend a lot of money
Money.
in the primary because he didn't think she was going to win. He raised a lot of money to go toward the general when the general election rolls around in November, and a lot of that money's just sitting in his coffers because he didn't spend it. And she came out and won, and it was a big upset, a big upset.
A
So
huge upset because it's like double digit winning, and
yeah,
also a large testament to like the sentiment of what's going on in
yeah,
states that are traditionally more conservative, and naming that she's a Black woman running for
yes,
Senate. That I want to also speak into the narrative building. She is a DSA member. I looked up how long she's been a member. She has been a member for a year, but she's also been serving in her political position since 2020. So she's
yes.
been, doing the work in Florida for the last 6 years
Hmm.
and just joining DSA. But what we're seeing is a narrative being built about like this kind of, socialist Democrat that is coming into power across the states. We're seeing middle America. Now we're seeing it happening in the South and other representatives. And so having like the political arm talk about socialism as it is, in a language that you use, a boogeyman. I didn't want to associate that specifically with Angie Nixon, but I do recognize how they are demonizing being a socialist and having an idea about different ways to run our policies with the
Hmm.
more consideration of a larger demographic of people, a united front of people who are saying we need our needs met. We would like to have universal health care. We would like to make sure that our young people have the education that they need. We would like to make sure that we can live in our homes. And that
Hmm.
is a different distribution of wealth than what we're
Right.
seeing under capitalism, which is not the free market that we speak into being a free market, because the free market only works for those who have access to the market to make a decision about supply and demand within the market. If you don't have the resources, if you don't have the money to play in the market, to buy in the market, to create products, to buy products, to trade products, then the market isn't free and it's not
No.
available to everyone. But the socialism ideology allows for a different redistribution of wealth so that more people have ability to thrive. And then when the least of us have their needs met, the greater of us have our needs met as well. And that is an understanding that is not being amplified as much as it's being demonized to think
Right.
about socialism.
Right.
Mhm.
And Angie Nixon, I mean, she was a labor organizer, so she has a track record. And you had said that she has been serving in the Florida state rep office since 2020. So she has a track record that people can look at, and apparently they really appreciate what she has fought for and what she has tried to affect change for her constituents at the state level. And so, but what's interesting to me when you asked me about why did I change my affiliation, I was thinking about also what I'm hearing about the aftermath of that primary. So she was running against a Black woman, running against this man that people came to know through the first Trump impeachment, he and his brother. And he is conservative Dem. He is Democratic establishment. He had the backing of the establishment, Democratic establishment in Florida. And he's got all of this money in his coffers. And the questions that I'm seeing kind of rolling around is, okay, Angie won the primary fair and square, by very, very respectable numbers. And so what are the Dems? What is the Democratic establishment going to do? Are they going to take the money that Alexander Vidman had in his coffers that he did not spend and put that towards Angie Nixon? Because bottom line is, don't we want the Democrat to win in that Senate seat? Or are they going to behave as we often see the Democratic establishment do and say, well, our guy didn't win, so you're on your own? And the fact that she's a Black woman and the fact that she has even the slightest affiliation with the Democratic Socialists of America makes it, as you said, they're building this narrative of why they wouldn't support her because she's this outside entity that we don't support. And this is exactly to my point about why I don't consider myself a Democrat anymore, because you can't tell me that you want to fight for human rights and access to healthcare and access to housing and, all of these things, and yet not support the candidate that the electorate obviously said we want over the other guy, but just because you got your panties in a twist because it wasn't the guy that you wanted and that would do your bidding. So yeah,
well, that's a contention that I think that the Democratic National Party has to work with all of the folks that they supported and that they've kind of fed into in the different local races that have occurred. Because we do know, I'm even thinking about in Florida, the race for governor, and David Jolly being the Democratic nominee that was identified through the Democratic National Party. And we also are recognizing from David Jolly that he was a Republican at first. He spent some time as an independent, and then he declared about 24 months before the Florida primary that he was a Democrat. I listened to his acceptance speech, and I was really alarmed, kind of knowing what the roots of his political ideology was, which is based in, the Republican Party. And he named that. He's like, I have not forgotten my roots. I have not forgotten where I've come from. And
he's always been very vocal about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And and there's, when I hear certain language, dog whistle language, like somebody like a David Jolly saying my brother, or when I was listening to the debate with Darlene Graham and Mr.
Ralph Norman,
my brother, my sister, my brother, my sister, that is language that I understand in camaraderie. And if that type of camaraderie is a camaraderie that's rooted in Republican ideals that are conservative and that are not inclusive of folks, regardless of being named the Democratic nominee, if you're in your acceptance speech saying that you're aligned with the roots of where you came from and you have not forgotten that, and you are looking forward to work with your brothers and sisters, it brings me back to what we understand of Project 2025, where they're saying that they are going to, the administration has a strategy of folks that are rooted in Republican ideology being planted in Democratic parties, so that then the ideology can be shifted towards a more conservative understanding and be then juxtaposed against a more, what we're calling, radical Democratic ideology in folks that align with DSA priorities and priorities that are more inclusive of a larger demographic of the US population.
What's interesting in hearing you lay that out, what occurs to me is, and this is raw thought, but I'm seeing a similarity between, so David Jolly came into my awareness years ago. He was on the MSNBC back when I used to watch it pretty regularly. And that was one of his that was always the introduction was he used to be a Republican. He's not anymore. He was one of the founding members of this organization called the Lincoln Project. And the narrative that they were pushing out was that a kinder, gentler return to what the Republican Party of Lincoln, because remember, the Republican Party of Lincoln is not the Republican Party of today. Or at least is at least the narrative of those parties are not the same. There might be arguments to be made that it hasn't changed, but
not only the narrative, the demographic of those parties have also switched.
Right. Because back in Lincoln's day, when he was a Republican, and many people may know this, but may not, is that the Democratic Party they called themselves the Dixiecrats. And they were, if you were to look at the ideology of the current Republican Party, and look at the ideology of the Dixiecrats, they were one and the same. They were separatist, white nationalism, white supremacy all day long, segregation now, segregation forever. That was what the Dixiecrats were into. And the Republicans were let's all get along. Can we, let's work together, equality, and all of those things. I don't think obviously the language that we use now that talks about DEI and talks about diversity and equality didn't exist. So they didn't use those terms, and I don't know if they would have had the terms existed, but it did flop. And that's where, if you hear the narrative of that, it wasn't the Republicans that started the MAGA movement, it was the Democrats. That's where that trope comes from, because the Democrats used to be of that ideological ilk. And then in the 60s with the Civil Rights Act, the Dixiecrats actually white flight out of the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party got the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act passed. And so they said, well, we ain't about that. So they fled over to the Republicans, and that's when the flip-flop happened. So I'm thinking about David Jolly's introduction and how he used to talk about how he was the part, Lincoln Project. That's why we started this. We want to get back to the original, the Republican roots, and how it's almost like what you were just describing in my head, it sounded like we're trying to create a Republican Party that is separate and apart from the MAGAs, from the extreme right-wing place of the Republicans, a kinder and gentler Republican Party. Juxtapose that with what's happening on the Democratic side, where we're now seeing DSA candidates, DSA endorsed candidates, and then DSA affiliated candidates winning in their primaries and, moving up in the ranks when it comes to platforms and narratives and things that they're running on as being different. And they're being made to be the boogeyman by the Democratic establishment. And it's really interesting to me. I don't even see the MAGAs demonizing the kinder, gentler Republicans, but I do see the Democratic establishment demonizing the DSA. So it's in our electorate, I feel like we're trying to figure out how to have multiple parties, and probably wrongly still trying to fit within the two parties, the Democratic umbrella and the Republican umbrella. It's just like, let it just go and name it something else. But we haven't gotten to the part where we're ready to be outside of the scheme. And I just think that's interesting. It just occurred to me that what's happening, the split or the change that is happening on the Republican side is doesn't to me seem to be as demonized by the MAGAs as what the changes that are happening on the Democratic side being demonized by the Democratic establishment. I'm curious if that, how that lands on you.
Yeah, okay, so I will go back to naming that I am seeing the political economy shifting, right? And what the ideology of the parties becoming more distinct on how people are aligning. So if we're looking at a bell curve, I would say Democratic Socialists are being named and demonized by those who have the power of the pen as, I don't know so much inside of the party, but those who have the power of the pen are building a narrative that the
Sure.
Democratic Socialists are extreme radicals, very much like, to me, the MAGA Republicans are. So like you got Democratic Socialist extreme radical, MAGA Republican extreme in their Republicanness. So you have those extremes within the party. And
Right.
then for those of us who are a little bit more progressive, we're seeing within the two parties this Republican conservatism and Democratic conservatism kind of in bed together, really under Citizens United and under corporate funding or PACT funding into the
Genocide
larger
supporting.
establishment of
Yes.
the party, which is what you were speaking about into the Vidman's thought, or David Chali being
Yeah.
the National Democratic nominee and where people are putting their energies into. The Republicans and the Democrats in the more middle of the lane conservatism are developing an ideology that matches, regardless of the fact that them naming themselves Republican or Democrat.
Doesn't matter.
They're
You'll
just
get the
in the bed.
same.
And those are the folks that exist right now in representation. And
Right.
so as we're seeing this new primary happen and we're seeing the new elections, we're seeing the folks that might be aligned or narrative built to be affiliated with what is being named as the more radical or progressive ideologies of each of the parties. That's the way that my brain is seeing like this political economy shifting and where people are aligning. Are you, I hate using this language, but this is the language of the time. So are you the more radical in your party or more progressive in your party? Then you are sitting on the outstreams. Are you the more conservative? Then you are in this interwoven dance of capitalism. It really comes back down
It
to
really does.
the economy. It's like where are you aligning with your support? A lot of the support we're seeing and in the larger establishments, and a lot of this money is coming from folks who represent and support Israel. And that's just real when we're looking at the numbers. Who is in support of the US's aggression outside of US territory on the world? Are you conservative with that? Are you aligned and in bed with that? And or are you in these extremes of like focusing on the needs of people in the US, which is the way that I'm experiencing the more progressive Democrats that are being named socialists? Or are you in this supremacy ideology that I'm experiencing out of the MAGAs? And so that's what I'm seeing happening. And I'm curious to see as we move forward into, the more general election season, how that partitions out across the states with the different ideologies. The South, I imagine we're going to see, and I'm saying I imagine this, but we are seeing that in the South, we're seeing that in the Midwest, more progressive people who are meeting the needs of the larger community of people whose needs are not being met, or who are getting support.
Yeah, and I guess in summary, I suppose the thing that is I think super important and imperative for people as we are, because the primaries are almost over. There is a runoff that's happening in South Carolina for Lindsey Graham's Republican primary space, because the primary happened on August 11th, and his sister, Lindsey Graham's sister, Darlene Graham, who was appointed into his seat after he died, she had to go through
administration.
she had to go through the primary process, and if you don't, I don't know if this is the case outside of South Carolina, but I do know in North Carolina, if you don't get at least 50%, if nobody gets at least 50% of the vote, then there's a runoff of the top two vote getters. So Darlene Graham and Ralph Norman neither one of them got 50%. He didn't get anywhere close. I think she was in the 30s, but they have to go through a runoff. So the runoff is happening right now for anybody that might be listening in South Carolina. Early voting is already open. Find out where you can go early vote. If you, let's see, South Carolina is not a closed primary. You can only vote in one primary or the other. So if you already voted in the Democratic primary, they're not going to let you vote in the Republican primary. But if you didn't vote in the earlier primary, you can vote in this one. So anyway, so just a plug for people to go and vote. But
be civically engaged. It does matter.
Yes, it does matter. It does matter, especially in states like South Carolina, if you want to try to see change happen. And especially
because our democracy is being eroded. So more people not participating in the
It
ways that
is.
we can participate in our democracy, the more that they believe that it doesn't matter to us.
Oh, I know what my point was.
Okay.
My point was pay attention to the narrative. So right
Yes.
now, the narrative kind of reigns supreme. It's not so much like, and maybe this has always been the case, but it's not so much, I think, of what the candidates say, although it is important what the candidates say, but also pay attention to what the narrative says, what the, like you said, the people with the power of the pen, either the journalists, either mainstream media, or if you're seeing lots of, newspaper headlines or whatever that lean one way or the other. I'm going to put in a plug for Ground News. Groundnews.com is a great website where they have the articles that are from all of the different affiliates, but what they do uniquely on Ground News is and this shameless plug, I'm not getting any money for this, but what they do uniquely at Ground News is they show you the bias. So they'll show you, they'll have an article on there that they then break down and says it's left leaning or it's right leaning or it's right in the middle. They talk about blind spots. So in the article, so it helps you understand media literacy, because that's one of the biggest, you need to pay attention to what the candidates are saying. And we know we get bombarded by television ads and articles in the newspaper and things online that are trying to get us to pay attention to what they want the narrative for us to buy, not the actual person. So that's just my shameless plug in terms of really, as we move out of the primary season and we head into the general election in November, it is imperative that we pay attention to not just what the candidates are saying, but what the narrative is about those candidates, and consider the source. Who are they selling it to? Who are they trying to influence? That's where we can make informed decisions. So that's my plug.
I appreciate the plug. And until next time, we'll have another conversation.
Yes, we will see you then.
All right.
Why do I give a fuck?
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, as you move throughout your day, continue to ask yourself,
Why do I give a fuck?
Why Do I Give a Fuck is produced in collaboration with Johanna and Diane. Music by Norwegian musician Water. See you next time.